Thanksgiving in Boise had always felt like a performance, but this year it was unbearable in a way I couldn't quite describe until it happened. I'd flown in the night before, taken a cab to my parents' house through the early snow, and walked into the kind of lukewarm greeting that made you feel more like a guest than a daughter. The house was decorated as always, garlands of plastic autumn leaves, a ceramic turkey in the center of the dining table, and the smell of roasted yams mixed with cinnamon-sweetened apples. But something about it all felt staged, like I was stepping onto a set, not coming home. They all acted normal at first, too normal in fact. Melissa greeted me with a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her husband Brett gave me one of those overly cheery, "Hey stranger," greetings as if we were college classmates who hadn't spoken since graduation. My mother, Sarah, kissed my cheek lightly and commented on how tired I looked, her voice full of the kind of concern that sounds more like criticism. My father, Mark, stayed quiet at first, busy carving the turkey, his back to me, sleeves rolled up, hands steady. We sat down to eat at 5, same as always. The table was full. My Aunt Deborah from Nampa had come, along with her husband and 2 cousins I hadn't seen in years. It was the usual crowd, all smiles and polite conversation, like everyone was reading from the same Thanksgiving script. But beneath it all I could feel something was off. Every glance in my direction felt a beat too long, every question a little too loaded. They asked about my job even though they knew I'd quit 6 months ago. Asked how I was doing in Portland knowing I'd moved out of my apartment. Melissa chimed in with updates about her new promotion, her second baby on the way, the renovations on their new house. I nodded and smiled, playing along, pretending I wasn't slowly being edged out of a space I used to belong to. Then somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the pumpkin pie, my father cleared his throat. The room quieted almost instantly. He looked across the table at me, not with anger exactly, but with something heavier, resolve. He reached under the table and pulled out a white envelope, setting it carefully in front of his plate. His fingers lingered on it for a moment. "Jane," he said, his voice unervingly calm, "we've been meaning to talk to you about your future." Every conversation at that table stopped. Forks were lowered. Even my cousins, who had been whispering to each other, fell silent. The warmth in the room dropped several degrees. I stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it. Something in me already knew this wasn't a gift. My mother leaned forward, her smile stretching a little too wide. "We just want what's best for you, sweetheart," she said. "It's time for a fresh start. A real one." She gestured at the envelope like it contained a miracle. I opened it slowly, already bracing myself. Inside was a check for $12,000 folded neatly, along with a one-way plane ticket to Savannah, Georgia. Dated for December 2nd. I stared at it, blinking. The room buzzed faintly in my ears, like my body was trying to protect me from the full weight of what was happening. "We've arranged everything," she continued. "You'll have a few weeks to get settled. There's a job waiting. A friend of your uncle's runs a hotel there. You'll love it, really. It's a beautiful city." I looked around the table. Melissa couldn't even meet my eyes. Brett was staring at his napkin, lips pressed in a thin line. My father nodded once, like this was a business decision and it had already been made. There was no discussion. No room for it. "You're not coming back to Portland," he added flatly. "It's not working." And that was the truth, wasn't it? This wasn't a suggestion. It was an ultimatum wrapped in a smile, handed to me in front of the entire family so that I wouldn't make a scene. They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving out of love or duty. They invited me so they could collectively push me out in one choreographed motion. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to ask them what I'd done to deserve this, to remind them that I was trying, that things had been hard but not impossible. But there was no point. They had already decided who I was. Someone who needed to be managed, removed, placed somewhere far away where I wouldn't disturb the picture they were trying to paint. I folded the check and the ticket and placed them back in the envelope. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything. I just set it on the table and picked up my fork again, even though I couldn't taste the food anymore. Around me, the conversation slowly resumed, awkwardly at first, like an orchestra picking up after a missed cue. My parents smiled, relieved. Melissa reached for the wine, finally exhaling. They thought they were saving me. Or maybe they thought they were saving themselves. Either way, the message was clear. I was no longer part of this family, at least not in the way that counted. When I looked up from the envelope, I saw her, Melissa. Phone already in hand, screen tilted just slightly to capture the whole scene. At first I thought she might be texting or maybe taking some harmless family video, the kind you post on Facebook with a caption like, "Thanksgiving vibes," or, "So grateful for family." But then I saw her face, too still, too focused, with that barely there smile curling at the corners of her mouth, and I understood. She was filming me. Her eyes weren't soft or affectionate. They gleamed with something sharper, colder. Satisfaction. Like she'd been waiting for this moment and didn't want to miss a second. Like she needed evidence. I caught the red recording light reflected in her glasses. She didn't flinch when I made eye contact. If anything, she steadied the shot. There I was, still holding the envelope, the check, the plane ticket, with every face at the table watching me, waiting. Melissa's husband, Brett, kept his eyes on his plate, pretending not to notice his wife's little production. But I could feel his discomfort radiating across the table like heat. Aunt Deborah raised her eyebrows in slow-motion surprise, caught somewhere between politeness and rubbernecking. My father looked down at his plate as if what he'd done wasn't unfolding right in front of a lens. And then there was Sarah, my mother, sitting a little too straight in her chair, her voice honeyed and rehearsed when she leaned in again and said, "It really is a generous offer, Jane. Not everyone gets that kind of support." Support. That's what they were calling it. A forced relocation and a cash buyout, neatly wrapped in family language. A fresh start under the guise of kindness, orchestrated in front of a live audience, and filmed no less. I looked back at Melissa, who didn't lower the phone. She wanted the whole thing, my humiliation, my reaction, my breakdown, saved on camera. Maybe to watch later, to share in hushed tones with friends or coworkers over wine. Maybe to show to her kids someday as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you don't get your life together. They thought I was going to fall apart, that I'd cry or scream or beg to stay. They were ready for it, bracing for it. Melissa especially. I could almost hear her internal monologue, narrating it as she filmed. And here's the moment Jane realizes no one believes in her anymore. Here's the exact second she sees that even her family has given up. But the irony, the part that would never make it into the video, that her little recording could never capture, was that only hours earlier, in a quiet hotel room 5 miles away, I'd signed a contract that would change everything. After 3 years of building, failing, rebuilding, pitching, sleeping in airports and working through weekends, I'd closed the deal. $9.3 million wired into my holding account by a group of investors in New York who had more faith in me than my own family ever did. And not a soul at that table knew. I had stared at the screen of my laptop that morning in disbelief, hand trembling slightly as I e-signed the final page. I remember whispering, "It's done," to no one. No champagne, no confetti, no one to hug. Just silence and the whir of the hotel's old heater. I'd taken a long breath, closed my computer and gotten ready for dinner, knowing exactly what kind of performance I was walking into. So now, with Melissa's phone aimed at me like a weapon, I let the silence stretch. I let the tension swell in the room like a held breath. I looked at each of them one by one, like I was memorizing their faces for some private museum exhibit I'd never let them into. I wanted them to think they'd won just for a moment longer. Then I smiled. Not bitterly, not sarcastically. Calm, clean. The kind of smile that says nothing and everything at once. And I said, "Thank you." No extra emotion. No sarcasm. Just 2 simple words. Melissa didn't move, didn't lower the phone. She kept recording, but her expression flickered. Something shifted just for a second. I saw it in her eyes. Uncertainty. Like she suddenly wasn't sure what she was capturing anymore. This wasn't the footage she wanted. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't desperation. It was control. It was composure. They couldn't read it, of course. To them, it probably looked like resignation, maybe even gratitude. But it wasn't. It was restraint. It was power wrapped in silence. Because they would never know what it took for me to sit there, still and measured, while they handed me my exile with smiles on their faces. And they would never understand how hollow their judgment felt compared to what I already knew about myself. I didn't need to prove anything to them. They had already made their choice. They wanted to cast me out, and they wanted a souvenir to remember it by. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. A clean shot. A quiet exit. A perfect ending to the story they had written in their heads about the sister who couldn't make it. But what they captured on camera wasn't my failure. It was my freedom. They always said Melissa had a bright future. Even when she barely scraped through her classes, even when her idea of ambition was joining the yearbook committee and quitting halfway through the semester, they clapped for her like she'd won a medal. At every family gathering, someone would mention how well-adjusted she was, how polished she seemed. It didn't matter that she coasted through high school on charm and late homework passes, or that she applied to one college, barely got in, and declared communications because she didn't know what else to do. She smiled sweetly, nodded at the right times, and somehow that was enough to make her the golden child. I was never jealous of Melissa. I was confused by her. Confused by how little effort could earn so much praise. Confused by how the same parents who scoffed when I won a regional robotics championship would gush when Melissa posted a blurry photo from a sorority mixer. I remember standing in the kitchen once after bringing home a science fair trophy. A tall, ridiculous-looking thing with gold plastic wings, and my father didn't even look up from his paper. He just muttered, "That's nice," and turned the page. But when Melissa was voted most spirited in her senior yearbook, they framed the page and hung it in the hallway. It wasn't that I needed their applause. It was that I had to work so hard to be seen at all. I started building things when I was 10. Little circuits, broken toys with rewired motors, anything that buzzed or moved. My bedroom floor was covered in wires and bits of old remote controls, and while other kids were begging for iPhones, I begged for soldering kits. I taught myself Python before I knew how to drive. But every time I tried to share something, to talk about the drone I was assembling from scratch or the app one was designing to help kids with dyslexia, I was told I was being intense. Too much. Try to be more like Melissa, my mother once said, stirring spaghetti sauce as if that line wasn't cutting me in half. In high school, when Melissa left for college, the house got quieter, but the comparisons never did. She was off at a private liberal arts school in Oregon, paid for in full by our parents, driving the gently used Volkswagen Jetta they gifted her as a graduation present. I stayed behind, going to the state university on partial scholarship, eating instant ramen in a shared apartment that smelled like old beer and moldy carpet, working at a bookstore during the day and a diner at night, and still running a freelance web design gig between exams just to keep my laptop from dying on me. No one ever asked how I managed to balance it. No one ever offered help. It was just expected that I'd figure it out. When Melissa called home, she'd talk about her professors, her roommates' drama, a new boy she liked. My parents would laugh, tell her to have fun, ask when she was coming home for the holidays. When I called, if I called, I'd get a rushed conversation, distracted voices in the background, and a question like, "So, are you dating anyone yet?" Like that was the most important metric of how well I was doing. There were moments, brief and cruel, where I thought maybe I was crazy, that I was imagining the difference. But it was always there, lurking under every interaction. When Melissa got a C, it was, the class must be hard. When I got an A-, it was, why not an A? When she came home for the summer and decided not to get a job, they told her she deserved a break. When I stayed on campus to work full-time and take extra credits, they asked why I didn't come visit more often. By the time I graduated, with honors, with a portfolio of projects that had already drawn interest from a few small tech startups, they didn't even fly out for the ceremony. They sent a card. Melissa got a party with balloons and cake, a garden full of relatives, and a sign on the front lawn. I got a check for $50 and a "proud of you" written in my mother's handwriting, the kind she reserved for thank you notes and birthday cards. I stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. But I never stopped feeling the ache of it. Not because I wanted to be Melissa, but because I wanted them to see me, not the version of me they had decided was difficult or too ambitious or always trying to prove something. Just me. The girl who stayed up until 4 a.m. debugging code while the radiator hissed and the city outside went silent. The woman who taught herself to survive on caffeine and curiosity, who turned every no into a reason to try harder, not because she had a choice, but because no one was coming to rescue her. And now, years later, sitting at that table under the weight of their judgment and their orchestrated exile, I could still feel the weight of all those silent years pressing on my shoulders. Melissa, phone in hand, still basking in the role they'd written for her. The good daughter. The normal one. The one who deserved to stay. But I wasn't bitter. Not in the way they expected. Not in the way they wanted, maybe. I had learned to live without their approval. I had built something real from the ruins of their neglect. And while they filmed what they thought was the final act of my failure, I sat there thinking about everything they would never know, because they never bothered to ask. The apartment in Spokane was so small I could touch both kitchen counters at once without taking a step. The radiator coughed more than it heated, and the window in the main room had a crack that let in a constant draft during the winter, even when I taped it over with layers of plastic. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my upstairs neighbor crying through the floorboards at night, and the pipes groaned whenever anyone in the building so much as ran a bath. It wasn't a place where most people would think to build a company. But it was what I had, and I wasn't waiting for anything better. There was no team in the beginning, just me, my laptop, and a folding table I bought at a garage sale. I wrote the first lines of code sitting on a camping chair with no back support, surrounded by empty coffee cups and notebooks full of scribbled ideas, half of them useless. I taught myself new programming languages from YouTube tutorials and open-source documentation, writing functions that broke again and again until they finally held. I knew enough to realize I didn't know enough, so I read constantly. Books, forums, case studies, anything I could get my hands on that might bring me one step closer to clarity. Every bug I fixed came with a wave of exhaustion and relief. Every feature I pushed live felt like a gamble. I was building something out of nothing, patching it together with stubbornness, duct tape, and the kind of faith that doesn't come from being told you're good at something, but from refusing to believe you're not. I didn't have connections. I didn't have friends in tech or an uncle who once worked at Google or a college mentor cheering me on. I had rejection emails. Dozens of them. From investors who told me they didn't see the potential, from accelerators who said I didn't fit their model, from people who smiled in meetings and then ghosted the second I walked out. I had people who told me to go back to working for someone else, and maybe scale it down to a side project. But I also had something they didn't. I had nothing left to lose. I lived lean. I worked 80, sometimes 90 hours a week. There were months when I wasn't sure I'd make rent, when dinner was a handful of peanuts and a packet of instant oatmeal. I skipped birthdays, missed weddings, forgot holidays. Not that my family noticed. I wasn't invited to most of them anyway. They thought I was isolating myself, pulling away, when in reality I was clawing my way through something they couldn't even begin to imagine. I pitched to investors through cracked Zoom screens, rehearsing my deck until I could recite it in my sleep. I took buses across state lines for meetings that lasted 15 minutes. I once waited 6 hours in a lobby for a VC who never showed up. I had moments when I wanted to give up. Moments when I cried in the shower, on the floor, on hold with banks that were flagging my transactions because my spending patterns didn't match their system. But then I would go back to the code. Back to the plan. Every setback just added fuel. Every no sharpened me. I didn't want to prove myself to the world. I wanted to prove myself to the version of me who had been told over and over again that she was difficult, intense, too much. I wanted to look that girl in the eye and say, "You were right to keep going." The product evolved slowly. At first it was clunky, barely functional. But I refined it. I tested it with small user groups, took feedback seriously, rewrote entire modules from scratch. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I gave up everything else. Dating, comfort, even the idea of a normal life. Because I believed in what I was building more than I believed in anything else. There was no one to call when something went right. No one to celebrate with when my first client signed on. I danced alone in my apartment that night, barefoot on the chipped linoleum floor, blasting music through my headphones so the neighbors wouldn't complain. No one knew what it had taken. No one saw the grind, the risk, the relentlessness. And still I kept going. My parents never asked how it was going. Not really. When I mentioned the startup during one Thanksgiving, my father said, "Oh, that's still a thing?" And then changed the subject. My mother smiled vaguely and told me I should try applying for something stable like a city job. They wanted to understand maybe, but only on their terms. Only if it fit into their idea of success. But I wasn't building this for them. I was building it for every time I was told to be quiet. For every trophy that went unnoticed. For every meal I skipped so I could make a software release deadline. For the 10-year-old girl soldering wires alone in her room while the rest of the house watched Melissa get ready for prom. I was building it to become undeniable. And even in that cold apartment with the heat barely working and the hours swallowing me whole, I knew, deep in my chest, that I was getting close. That one day, whether they were watching or not, it would all shift. Not suddenly, but irreversibly. And when it did, I wouldn't need to explain a thing. An hour before dinner, I sat alone in a beige hotel room with the curtains drawn and my laptop open on the edge of the bed, watching the final loading screen process the wire confirmation. The amount glowed faintly on the screen, more real than I expected it to feel. $9,300,000. I didn't breathe for a few seconds after the notification came through. The email sat there in my inbox like a private miracle, silent and undeniable. My heart thudded once, deep in my ribs, not with shock but with the weight of something I'd carried for too long finally falling away. I didn't scream or laugh or cry. There was no one to perform for. I just stared at it, my hands resting flat on my thighs, the light from the laptop flickering against my skin. My name was on that contract. My idea, my product, my sweat. I had signed every page alone, negotiated every term while eating dollar store almonds in airport terminals. I'd gone through months of legal back and forth, endured calls where male investors questioned if I had a technical co-founder behind the scenes doing the real work. I had answered every email myself, rewritten the pitch deck a dozen times, and flown to San Francisco on a red-eye I paid for with borrowed miles. And now it was done. No one at that dinner table knew. They saw the same Jane they'd always seen, the one who didn't fit in, who missed holidays, who never smiled right in family photos, who lived in the wrong cities and pursued the wrong dreams. They saw a failure to launch, a cautionary tale dressed in borrowed confidence. They didn't see a woman who had just sold her startup for more than all of them combined would earn in a lifetime. They didn't see a founder, a CEO, a self-made success. They saw a black sheep with fraying edges. That made it easier. I arrived at the house just before dinner, changed into a plain sweater and jeans, and took a seat like it was just another forced family gathering. I let the questions come. Still doing that computer stuff? Didn't you have some website or app or whatever? Is that still going? I nodded, played it down, let the condescension roll past me like background static. Melissa's voice was the loudest, of course. Casual jabs dressed as curiosity, as if my very presence at the table was proof that I'd failed. The moment they handed me that envelope, the check and the one-way ticket to Savannah, I felt the irony vibrate inside me like a live wire. $12,000. The gift. The fresh start. It was meant to look like compassion, but it felt like an execution. They had gathered everyone to witness it, this carefully staged moment of quiet removal, and I let them believe they'd succeeded. I smiled, small and calculated, not because I felt any warmth but because I understood the assignment. Melissa filmed it all. Her phone was angled discreetly, but I saw the light. She was documenting what she thought would be my humiliation, archiving my supposed failure for later enjoyment, as if I wouldn't notice the way her eyes sparkled with triumph. I said, "Thank you," like I was agreeing to their story, like I was ready to go. They had no idea they were looking at someone who'd already won. In that moment, I wasn't just holding back truth. I was preparing the space for it. They wanted to define me by what they thought I didn't have: security, success, stability. But what I held in my mind was more powerful than anything they could take away. I had already made peace with the version of myself they couldn't understand. I had built something from nothing while they whispered behind my back, while they assumed the worst, while they dismissed every update I ever gave them about my work as a phase or a hobby or a sign of imbalance. I let them believe they were the ones in control. I let them speak over me, pity me, smile, that rehearsed smile that comes when you think someone is too far gone to recover. I leaned into it, letting the silence settle between bites of overcooked turkey and too sweet cranberry sauce. No one asked what I had been doing that week. No one noticed the slight tremor in my fingers from signing one of the most important contracts of my life. No one even knew the name of my company. That suited me just fine. Because this was the quiet before the storm. The part where everyone thinks the story has ended when it's only just shifted. I was already writing the next chapter in my head. Composed, deliberate, precise. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was colder, sharper. Clarity. They didn't know who I was. They never had. They had spent years constructing a version of me that fit their narrative, and I had finally outgrown it so fully, so completely, that I didn't even feel the need to correct them anymore. I accepted their exile with the calm of someone who had already left. Not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, financially. I wasn't sitting at their table anymore. I was just passing through. And the beauty of it was that they would never see it coming. They wouldn't understand until it was already too late. Until long after the cameras had stopped rolling, the turkey was eaten and the leftovers were packed away. They would remember the silence. They would remember the smile. But they would never forget what came after. The hallway light was dim, one of those old yellow-tinted bulbs that buzzed faintly in the silence, casting long shadows against the textured wallpaper my parents never bothered to change. I hadn't meant to stop there. I was just looking for a quiet place to breathe, to shake off the weight of the envelope still sitting heavy in my coat pocket. I needed a moment to collect myself before pretending again. But the voices reached me before I could turn the corner, soft at first, then sharp and unmistakably clear as they carried through the cracked door of the den. I froze. "I think we were too generous," my mother said, her voice low and deliberate, laced with that familiar condescension she tried to dress up as concern. $12,000? That's more than she's earned in the last year, I'm sure. She laughed lightly, the way someone does when they're pretending to be modest about cruelty. My breath caught. "She wouldn't have lasted another month in Portland," my father added. "We did her a favor. At least this way she's someone else's problem. I'm just glad we finally put a stop to this nonsense." It was embarrassing. The words snapped like a rubber band against my skin. Embarrassing. That was what I had been to him. An eyesore, a burden, a stain on his well-groomed version of family. He kept going. "I mean, for God's sake, she's almost 30. Still playing with gadgets like a damn teenager. It's time she grew up." Then Melissa's voice cut in, bright and venomous. "Grew up? She peaked in high school with her little science fair trophies and thought she was a genius. That startup she's always mumbling about? It's probably some blog she updates once a month from her phone." They all laughed. Brett's voice followed, tired but relieved, like someone shaking off a weight. "Honestly, I'm just glad it's done. You could feel it, you know? That heaviness every time she walked in the room. Like we were all pretending not to notice." I stood there, utterly still, pressed against the wall like I could melt into it. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I let their words crawl over me like insects, let them burrow in, bite, settle beneath my ribs. The laughter echoed, each chuckle slicing a little deeper, but I stayed quiet. Their celebration, because that's what it was, a celebration, was not meant to be heard. They thought I was gone. They thought I'd taken their money, their insult, their ticket out, and disappeared like a good little failure. They didn't know that their humiliation had missed its target. That while they toasted to my departure, I had already slipped into another world entirely. That the small tech project they mocked had just become the foundation of a company valued in the millions. They didn't know that the woman they were laughing about could buy this entire house twice over in cash and still have money left to disappear forever if she wanted. But I said nothing. Not yet. I listened a little longer until my mother sighed and muttered something about how exhausting I'd always been. Melissa agreed, saying how refreshing it would be to have peace again during the holidays. My father made a joke about reclaiming his study, the one I used to sleep in when I visited. They all laughed again, warm and casual, like they'd finally cured a chronic illness. And I stood there, rooted in the hallway of the house I grew up in, hearing, truly hearing, what they thought of me when they believed I couldn't hear them. Didn't surprise me. That was the worst part. I didn't flinch. It wasn't shock that gripped me, it was confirmation. A brutal, clean-edged truth. This was who they were. This was what I had been running from, trying to prove myself against, trying to love in spite of. They were laughing at a ghost. The version of me they'd built in their minds, pitiful, delusional, desperate for scraps of their approval, didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. And while they sat comfortably in the glow of their own smug relief, not one of them stopped to ask what it meant that I had accepted their offer so easily, so calmly. Not one of them thought to question the silence in my smile. They thought they'd buried me, but they never even saw the fire they lit. When I stood at the doorway, coat zipped, shoes already damp from the slush outside, no one followed me. My mother gave a practiced smile and a quick, light hug that didn't land fully on my shoulders. My father didn't bother to get up from his chair. He only nodded once, a gesture that felt more like closing a transaction than saying goodbye to a daughter. Melissa, still basking in the glow of her performance, waved lazily from across the room and made some throwaway comment like, "Good luck in Georgia," as if I were headed off to serve a quiet sentence in some faraway place. Brett didn't say anything at all. Just stared past me like I'd already left. It was the kind of farewell you give someone you never planned to see again. A clean, final sweep. No fuss, no warmth, no chance to return. And I let them have it. I let them believe I was walking away in defeat, carrying the last shreds of pride in an envelope they had signed with arrogance. There was no anger in me anymore, just a heavy calm, a silence that held everything I had endured and everything I no longer owed. The wind outside bit hard as I stepped off the porch, the sky an iron gray, the kind that presses low and makes the whole world feel close and cold. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Their voices had already faded, their house already smaller in my mind than the apartment I was returning to. Each step toward the cab felt like a loosening, like a thread that had wrapped around my chest for years was finally beginning to snap strand by strand. When I got back to my studio, the lights were still off. I didn't turn them on right away. I just stood there for a moment, inside that quiet space that had held my failures and breakthroughs and sleepless nights, and let the stillness sink in. It smelled faintly of dust and cheap takeout containers, the air sharp with the kind of cold that slips through the edges of old window panes. I set my coat on the chair, kicked off my boots, and walked over to the desk where my laptop still sat. Open, the screen dark but glowing faintly with reflected light from the city outside. I touched the trackpad. The screen came to life instantly, and there it was again. The contract, the confirmation, the dollar amount that had once felt unreachable. I stared at my name typed in digital ink next to the signatures of people who believed in what I'd built. People who had looked at my work and seen value, not embarrassment. Not burden. Not failure. Just potential and then proof. And then something cracked quietly inside me. I sat down slowly in the chair, leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and let my face fall into my hands. The tears came without warning, hot, silent, and relentless. Not from pain. Not from anger. From release. From the weight finally lifting off my shoulders after years of carrying it without help, without comfort, without even the dignity of recognition. I cried like someone who had finally put down something that had been breaking her spine. I cried because I didn't have to prove anything anymore. Because I had done it. I had done it alone. They hadn't helped. Not once. They hadn't called to check in during the hard months, hadn't offered a cent of support, hadn't come to a single pitch, read a single update, or even asked about the name of the company I was bleeding myself dry to build. They hadn't believed in me. And yet I had done it anyway. I had carved something real from the silence they left me in. And now I was free. Not just from them, but from the need for them. From the idea that their approval was still something I had to chase or earn or long for. I had already outgrown their version of me. What they thought I was didn't matter anymore. I was more than they ever allowed themselves to imagine. The tears slowed eventually, leaving behind a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. A peace. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater, leaned back in the chair and looked around the studio. The peeling paint, the crooked shelves, the cables coiled across the floor like veins feeding the heart of my work. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine. And this, all of it, I had done without them. When I stepped out of the airport in Savannah, the air was different, not just in temperature or scent but in weight. It was early afternoon, the sun hanging low but still warm enough to touch the skin, and the breeze carried the quiet hum of a city that didn't yet know me. I took it in slowly, the soft light pouring through the canopy of trees, the Spanish moss hanging from the branches like something out of a dream. I wasn't arriving as someone who had been cast out. I was stepping into this city as someone who had chosen herself. This wasn't exile. It was a beginning. I had rented the apartment online, sight unseen, just a few days after Thanksgiving. A restored unit in an old brick building on the edge of the historic district. 3rd floor, plenty of natural light, hardwood floors that creaked when you walked too fast. The kind of space that didn't shout for attention but welcomed you with a quiet confidence. When I unlocked the door for the first time and stepped inside, I didn't feel fear or disorientation. I felt clarity. I dropped my bag by the door, walked across the empty living room and opened every window. The space filled with air and possibility. For a long moment I just stood there listening to the distant sounds of the street below. Bikes passing, a dog barking, wind brushing against old shutters. I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel alone. I felt untouched, untethered. Like I had slipped out from under something heavy and had room to stretch again. The check they gave me, $12,000 meant to buy my compliance, my disappearance, my quiet shame. I didn't destroy it. I didn't even hide it away. I used it deliberately, strategically, like a scalpel, not a crutch. I framed it in my mind as an artifact, a piece of evidence in a case I'd already won. It paid my first 3 months' rent. It covered a new desk, an ergonomic chair, a large second monitor, and a coffee maker that brewed exactly the way I liked it. Strong, clean, unhurried. I ordered whiteboards and lined the walls with them, filled them slowly with notes, sketches, and plans. The first thing I mounted was a printout of the contract I'd signed. Above it, in plain black marker, I wrote one word: proof. There was no desire in me to go back. Not to the house in Boise, not to the rooms filled with polite cruelty, not to the family dinners where silence meant survival. I didn't miss their voices or the way they always looked past me, through me. I didn't even feel bitterness anymore. Just distance. Cold, clean, necessary distance. They were a closed chapter, one that had taught me more through absence than presence. I carried the memory of them the way you carry an old scar. Still there but no longer tender to the touch. My days began early. I got up with the sun, made coffee, opened the windows and let the light in. I worked in quiet, focused stretches, broken only by long walks through streets lined with cobblestones and iron balconies, where strangers said hello without knowing a thing about me. I moved through the city anonymously, freely, with no expectations pressing down on me, no past dragging behind me like a chain. I was just a woman with a laptop, a vision, and the freedom to build on her own terms. There was peace in that. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to them. Not even to myself. I had already done the hardest thing. I had made it. I had survived the disbelief, the indifference, the cold rooms and colder conversations. And now every corner of this new apartment, every blank space waiting to be filled, whispered the same quiet truth. This is yours. This city wasn't a hiding place. It wasn't a consolation prize. It was a reset, a conscious, deliberate choice to begin again, untangled from the past, untouched by their limitations. For the first time in a long while, my life belonged entirely to me. And I wasn't going back. Not ever. It was Wednesday morning when I saw the headline. I hadn't been waiting for it, not exactly, but I knew it would come. I was sipping coffee, sitting at my desk in the quiet of my new apartment, bare feet tucked beneath me, when the screen lit up with the notification. I clicked the link instinctively, heartbeat steady, breath slow. There it was, top placement, center banner, startup out of Spokane acquired for $9.3 million. Founder, 29-year-old self-taught programmer Jane Larson. No embellishments, no unnecessary flair. Just fact. My name, right there in bold type, framed by praise, embedded in a narrative no one from my past had ever believed I could write. The article spread like fire. Within an hour it was on the homepages of every major tech outlet, TechCrunch, Wired, Forbes, Business Insider, each repeating the same few details. Early stage growth, a uniquely scalable backend, a clean exit. My product. My code. My company. My story. There were pull quotes about resilience, about building from nothing, about quiet vision turned to real success. Some of the outlets called me underrated, others one of the industry's quiet disruptors. They spoke of me like I had appeared out of nowhere, as if I hadn't been quietly clawing my way here, line by line, day after punishing day. My phone rang before I finished reading the first paragraph. Unknown number. Then another with an Idaho area code. I didn't answer. The third call was from my father's cell. I watched it vibrate on the desk, a sharp contrast against the calm stillness of the room. Then it stopped. A minute later my mother. Then Melissa. Then the landline at the house in Boise I hadn't called in months. They didn't text. They called. Again and again. As if their voices would carry more weight than words now. as if hearing my breath might bring me closer. I didn't pick up. I sat there letting the calls pour in, watching as each name appeared and then disappeared from the screen. Aunt Deborah, Uncle Frank, Cousin Hannah. All the ones who had laughed softly at family dinners when my parents made jokes at my expense. All the ones who'd asked condescending questions and called me ambitious, like it was a flaw. All the ones who said nothing when I was spoken over. Now their names filled my missed call log like a parade of too late acknowledgments. Voicemails followed. My mother's voice, too bright, carefully controlled. Sweetheart, we just saw the news. Why didn't you tell us? We're so proud of you. Please call me back. My father's was shorter, more clipped. Jane. Congratulations. We should talk. Melissa sounded confused beneath her forced cheer. Oh my God, Jane, this is crazy. Call me. This is amazing, really. Everyone's talking about it. I let them stack up one by one. They weren't calling out of pride. They were calling because the world had just rewritten my story without their permission. The version they'd lived in, the one where I was the disappointment, the misfit, the difficult one, had collapsed under the weight of a single headline. Now strangers knew what they never wanted to admit, that the quiet girl they tried to remove had done what none of them ever could. I had built something real, valuable, respected, and they were desperate to be part of it. But I didn't owe them that. Not the return call, not the comfort of my voice, not the invitation to bask in a success they had tried to erase. They weren't proud of me. They were scrambling to catch up to a narrative they had been blindsided by. And beneath every message, every voicemail, I could hear the same panic. We misjudged her. We pushed her out. And now she doesn't need us. They were right. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window, the sunlight filtering through the moss-draped trees, everything soft and golden in the morning calm. The world was quiet again. My phone continued to buzz at the edge of my vision, names rising and falling on the screen like ghosts knocking at a door that would never open. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I had already said everything I needed to in silence. I didn't respond. Not once. Not when the calls turned into messages, not when the messages turned into emails, not when the emails started arriving through mutual contacts, old classmates, distant relatives who suddenly happened to be in Savannah. I didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't warn. I simply began cutting the threads one by one, with a calm, clean precision that felt almost surgical. First, I blocked their numbers. My mother's, my father's, Melissa's. Then I moved through my inbox and deleted every unread message, even the ones marked urgent or please read. Especially those. When I blocked them on social media, I did it without a second thought. No ceremony. No hesitation. Just a quiet refusal to let their eyes follow me anymore. I didn't want their approval, their apologies, or their interpretations of who I'd become. I didn't want their sudden praise, dressed in desperation. It all felt like a transaction too late to close, an offer that expired the moment they pushed me out of their lives with a smile and a check. My mother tried to find other ways in. I could see the shape of her strategy before it even reached me. Messages through her old friend from book club who I hadn't spoken to in years. A forced, cheerful voicemail from a former neighbor asking how I was doing and mentioning how, your mom says hello. An email sent from an address I didn't recognize until I opened it and saw her familiar, breathless tone. Jane, please, we just want to talk. This can't be how things end. It was. My father, ever the practical one, didn't bother with sentiment. He sent a string of messages about financial matters, asking to discuss potential tax implications from the acquisition. As if I needed his guidance now. As if I hadn't spent the last 5 years teaching myself every aspect of business, finance, compliance. Alone. He addressed me like a stranger. Formal, clipped, already sliding back into control mode, trying to reframe the relationship through numbers and legalese. I read the subject line, closed the email and blocked him too. Melissa's messages were the loudest. They came in bursts, text after text, all rapid, uneven, her voice bleeding through every word. Jane, this is ridiculous. We're family. Please don't do this. Then the shift. You're acting insane. After everything we've done? And finally, you're my sister. You don't just erase that. But I could. And I did. I didn't respond to the guilt or the pleading or the flailing justifications. I let the silence stretch out and fill the space where their words used to sit. The same silence I had lived in for years while they overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed me. I had become fluent in that silence. Now I wielded it like armor. They weren't entitled to access me simply because I shared their blood. They had already proven what that meant to them. Conditions, performance, obedience. And when I stopped meeting those conditions, when I stopped performing the role of failure, of disappointment, of tolerated inconvenience, they tried to rewrite the script. But the curtain had already closed on their version of me. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation, no cathartic phone call. Just absence. Just a clean, unspoken line that I would not let them cross. Every plea, every attempt to reopen the door was met with the same thing. Nothing. I didn't send a thank you for the check. I didn't acknowledge the fresh start they tried to orchestrate. I didn't tell them about the apartment or the press, or the offers that were already flooding my inbox from firms who now knew my name. They had lost the right to know anything about my life the moment they decided I wasn't worth a seat at their table unless I sat in silence. So I gave them what they wanted. I disappeared, from their phones, their inboxes, their lives. And for the first time in years I was completely, perfectly free. I never intended to make anything public. I never posted, never bragged, never pointed fingers or called anyone out. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The world did it for me. It started quietly, just a few tech journalists referencing a difficult past in their coverage of my story, quoting the few lines I'd offered about building alone, without support, without safety nets. Then someone somewhere found the video. The one Melissa had filmed so proudly at the Thanksgiving dinner, the one she had probably shared casually with a friend, expecting admiration or agreement. A moment of supposed triumph, her smirk behind the camera as our father pushed the envelope across the table. My silence. My, thank you. The room full of faces that seemed so proud to see me go. The clip exploded. It spread first on tech Twitter, captioned with disbelief. This woman built a $9.3 million company and her family paid her to disappear. Then came the memes. Melissa's voice dubbed over with satire, the word fresh start, turned into a punchline, the envelope becoming a symbol of small-minded cruelty. People dissected every second. The way my mother looked at me like a problem to be managed, the way no one stood up, the way I didn't flinch. I didn't share the video. I didn't even comment on it. But I watched it once, alone in my apartment, and felt a strange stillness settle in my chest. They had written their own downfall. I had only held my ground. In Boise, the consequences came fast. My mother, Sarah, always the perfect hostess, the respected presence in her circles, was quietly removed from the women's boards she belonged to. The invitations stopped. Her name, once associated with good taste and perfect dinner tables, became shorthand for the kind of cruelty that hides behind forced smiles and wine glasses. Her friends didn't call to confront her. They just stopped returning hers. Her reputation dissolved, not in scandal but in embarrassment. No one wanted to be associated with a woman who tried to exile her own daughter and got caught. My father, Mark, lost most of his clients within weeks. He'd built his practice on image, steady, professional, a family man. But no one wanted to sit across the desk from someone who humiliated his child on camera, who smirked as he pushed her out of his life for $12,000. Referrals dried up. Longtime clients canceled meetings. He told himself it was a coincidence. But even he knew the look people gave him now wasn't the same. Respect had curdled into quiet disgust. And Melissa, my sister, my camerawoman, faced the worst of it. Her video became the centerpiece of the storm. The comments were brutal. People dissected her tone, her expression, the way she didn't say a word to stop it. She became a meme, a trending symbol of performative cruelty. Then came the fallout. Her employer, a marketing firm obsessed with image, let her go without much ceremony. Not aligned with our values, they said in the statement. Her husband filed for divorce 2 weeks later. She moved back in with our parents shortly after. No one came to defend them. They had crafted themselves into a trio of superiority for years, confident, well put together, certain of their rightness. And now, stripped of their illusion, they wandered through the wreckage like people waking up in someone else's nightmare. The same people who had dismissed me, belittled me, cast me out, now stood alone under the weight of their own performance. They had been so sure they were the ones writing the story. And all along they were the cautionary tale. I didn't reach out. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, I told you so. The silence they had once weaponized against me was now mine to keep. A boundary, a verdict, a mirror they couldn't avoid. They lost access to my life. And now they had lost their standing in their own. The lights in the conference hall were harsh, clinical, and hot against my skin as I stood beneath them, my voice steady, my hands open as I walked through the final slide of my keynote presentation. The room was packed, filled with executives, engineers, founders, students, people who had shown up not because of who I was before but because of what I had built. When I spoke now they listened. Not out of courtesy but out of interest. I had earned that. Every second of it. I had just finished speaking about resilience in tech leadership. How innovation doesn't happen in pristine labs or comfortable offices, but in the margins, in places where people have no backup plan, no safety net, just a stubborn refusal to disappear. There was a moment just before the applause where I caught sight of them. Second row from the back. My mother. My father. Sitting shoulder to shoulder like they had every right to be there. My chest tightened, not in pain, not in fear, but in recognition. They were older than I remembered, more hollow around the eyes. My mother had her hair pinned too tight, the way she always did when she wanted to project control. My father sat stiff, wearing the kind of suit that was once his armor but now looked more like a costume. They clapped too, quietly, out of sync with the rest of the room. I stepped down from the stage. They were already moving toward me before I even made it past the front row of handshakes and congratulations. I saw my mother mouth my name, her lips forming it with a softness that hadn't been there the last time she said it aloud. My father followed, his face tight, but behind his eyes something like hope flickered. I didn't stop. I walked toward the green room at the side of the hall, and of course they followed. They caught up to me in the hallway just outside the backstage door. "Jane," my mother said first, reaching out without thinking, her fingers grazing my arm. "Please." I turned, fully. Not because I needed to, but because I had earned the right to look them in the eye on my terms. "We're sorry," she said. "About everything. About how things happened. We were wrong." My father stood beside her, stiff, silent, nodding once like that alone was his contribution. I looked at them both, and for a brief moment, the absurdity of it all threatened to make me laugh. They had come all this way, into my world, the one they had done everything to deny existed, because now it was real, visible, respected. "No," I said quietly. "You're sorry now because it's public. Because you got caught. Because the narrative changed and you're not the heroes in it." They tried to speak again, but I held up my hand. "You dismissed everything I ever cared about," I continued, voice calm, clear, unmoved. "When I built my first prototype, you told me it was childish. When I worked 2 jobs just to stay in school, you said I was being dramatic. When I poured myself into code for 80 hours a week in a freezing apartment, you told people I was still figuring things out. You didn't just fail to support me. You made me feel like I was something to be ashamed of." My father's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. "You gathered a room of relatives to hand me a check like I was a burden you were paying to get rid of. You filmed it. You laughed about it. You joked about how relieved you were when I left. That wasn't love. That was rejection with frosting." My mother blinked quickly like she was trying not to cry, but I didn't feel pity. I felt clarity. "You don't get to rewrite the story now. You don't get to walk into this chapter like you were part of the ones before. You weren't. And you won't be. Melissa wasn't there. Maybe that was for the best." I looked at them for one last moment. Not with hate. Not even with anger. Just distance. The kind that isn't meant to be crossed. Then I turned and walked away. Not out of cruelty. Not for spectacle. But because I didn't owe them anything more. I had already walked through fire. I didn't need to bring the ashes with me. I didn't realize how heavy the shadow had been until I stepped out of it for good. For most of my life, I had moved like someone expecting the ground to shift beneath her at any moment, always glancing over my shoulder, carrying the echo of voices that told me I was too much, too strange, too stubborn to belong. But when that weight finally lifted, there was no dramatic transformation, just space. Stillness. And for the first time, I didn't fill it with work or worry. I let it breathe. In that space, I began building something new. Not just for myself but for people like me. I started a company with a clear mission. To support first-time founders who had no connections, no financial backing, no one telling them they could make it. I built an accelerator specifically for the outsiders, the misfits, the quiet obsessives with more ideas than resources. I offered mentorship I never received, funding I never had, belief I had once begged for in silence. It wasn't charity. It was restoration. My calendar filled up quickly, with pitch reviews, strategy calls, product audits. But this time it wasn't out of desperation. It was alignment. My days felt full, not heavy. I was creating from abundance, not survival. At night I wrote. At first, the blog was anonymous. I shared pieces of my story, raw and unvarnished, about what it meant to build in isolation, to endure neglect disguised as discipline, to make peace with solitude before ever tasting recognition. I didn't expect much. But people found it. They shared it. They wrote to me. Young women, burnt-out engineers, exhausted students, dreamers holding their breath. They told me they saw themselves in the words. That they felt less alone. That maybe they could do it too. I started signing my name. And the blog went viral. It didn't make me famous. It made me visible. To the right people, the quiet ones, the ones who needed to know they weren't crazy for believing in something no one else saw. I began getting invitations to speak not as a novelty, but as someone who had lived through the storm and walked out whole. In between the work, I started saying yes to things I used to postpone indefinitely. Travel, long dinners with people who laughed with their eyes, books that had nothing to do with productivity. I let the edges of my life soften. I learned to let silence be restful, not punishing. I moved slowly through new cities, letting their rhythms fold into mine. In Lisbon I learned to like the ocean again. In Kyoto I spent whole afternoons wandering temples without speaking a word. In Oaxaca, I danced barefoot under paper lanterns in someone's garden, drinking something sweet from a clay cup. Somewhere along the way I adopted a golden retriever from a rescue shelter. I named him Oliver. He had big eyes and a cautious heart. It took him a few weeks to trust me completely. He followed me from room to room, always close, always waiting to see if I'd leave again. But when he finally started sleeping at the foot of my bed, his body curled just so, I knew we'd found home in each other. He reminded me what it felt like to be chosen for no reason other than being present. I made new friends slowly, carefully, not for optics, not for networking, but for connection. The kind of people who didn't need a resume to respect me, who didn't flinch when I talked about burnout or loneliness, who didn't mistake silence for weakness. We built friendships over homemade dinners, inside jokes, and long walks without agendas. No one asked about my family. And I didn't offer it. Not out of shame. Just because that story no longer took up space in the room. I no longer lived with the urgency to prove anything. I had nothing left to prove. For the first time in my life I was not just independent. I was whole. I was no longer building from spite but from clarity. No longer pushing against a door that refused to open, but standing in wide fields, windows open, morning light spilling across a room filled with plants and warmth and a dog snoring softly on the rug. I was not just surviving anymore. I was happy. Fully, quietly, entirely. The letters started arriving after the articles stopped. Handwritten, formal, some smudged like someone had cried on them or tried to make it look like they had. My mother's handwriting hadn't changed. Round, meticulous, overly careful, as if even now she was trying to control the way she was seen on the page. She wrote about how hard it was to be a parent, how they made mistakes, how, we always believed in you even if we didn't say it the right way. My father's notes were shorter, more clipped, straining for humility but still rigid between the lines. He wrote things like, we misjudged you, and you've made us proud even if we didn't show it. As if acknowledgement now could dissolve the years of silence and dismissal. But I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them and not because I hadn't heard what they said. I had. I just didn't believe it was my responsibility to carry their regret. Forgiveness, in the way they wanted it, implied a reset. A clean slate. And what they didn't understand, what they refused to understand, was that not everything can or should be undone. Some things remain. Some things should. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need apologies carved in cursive and sent weeks too late. I needed space. I needed peace. And I had earned both. I had no interest in reopening doors I'd already walked through and closed. The past didn't haunt me anymore. It had simply settled behind me like a house I once lived in, now empty and locked. They remained inside it, pacing through familiar rooms, trying every doorknob. But I was gone. I had built a different life. One with walls I chose. One with light I let in on my terms. One with windows that didn't face backward. Their calls went unanswered. Their emails were unread. The letters were boxed, unburned but unopened. I didn't need to read another line to know what they said. I had heard their voices for decades. First in commands, then in silence, then in pity. I didn't need to hear them again, even softened into apology. Because I remembered everything. I remembered every moment I was told to be more like your sister. Every time my achievements were brushed off as just computer stuff. Every meal I ate alone while they praised Melissa's every average success like it was extraordinary. I remembered being handed a check and a plane ticket like I was being paid to disappear. I remembered the video. The laughter. The hallway where I heard them mock me like I was a burden finally removed. That memory didn't weigh me down anymore. But I carried it like a scar, not to feel the pain but to remember who I had become in its absence. And the truth was I had become everything they said I couldn't. I had built something lasting, something real. I had created companies, mentored founders, written stories that moved people who didn't know me but still believed in me. I had spoken on stages, walked through cities I once only saw in books, made a life I didn't need to justify or defend. I had planted roots in soil of my own choosing, not the garden I was never allowed to touch. And I did it all without their blessing. That was the real victory. Not the success. Not the money. Not even the recognition. But the fact that I had done it with no one behind me, no one pushing me forward, no one clearing the path. Just me. I was not the product of encouragement or privilege. I was the product of survival. Of clarity. Of relentless insistence that I mattered even when no one else believed it. They wanted to be part of that now. But it was too late. They had chosen absence when I needed presence. They had offered judgment instead of grace. And now the absence was mine to choose. It wasn't loud or vengeful. It was clean, quiet, final. My silence wasn't cruelty, it was truth. It was protection. It was self-respect wrapped in stillness. And every time I launched a new venture, every time a founder told me I helped them believe in themselves, every time someone quoted my words back to me in a room where I once would have felt invisible, I knew. This was what power looked like. Not shouting. Not punishing. Not proving. Just existing. Without apology. Without approval. Without them.